Hi everybody, thank you very much for coming to listen to me talk about new ways to work. My name is Rachel Smith. I'm a third year PhD student based at Bath University and Cardiff University, and I'm here in my capacity as a committee member and seminar convener for History Lab, the postgraduate wing of the Institute of Historical Research. I'm here to present the sort of student side of the sort of pandemic and how it's changed archival and historical research practices, and actually how we might be able to move forward with these changes. So I've surveyed history students across Twitter, so I've put out a call far and wide to think about how things have changed since the pandemic. In terms of things like historical research practices, archival access, and also the types of sources that have been used. Unsurprisingly, digital resources or sources that weren't available to be digitized, either through methods like photography or photocopying, were the main thing that came up. But also mentioned were things like financial challenges, accessing material objects, particularly for those studying material culture, and the inequality of university and archival incomes, which meant that resources that were available to others were not available to some. So thinking about the sort of current state of things, more from a sort of student perspective, is that we are really reliant in times of such as a pandemic on the digital. And this has resulted in many students either adapting projects to accommodate solely digitized primary and secondary materials, or even to the other end of things, deferring their degrees until these manuscript sources are available from archives, libraries and museums. Some projects, due to a lack of digitization or maybe high financial costs, were inaccessible to some, highlighting the inequalities that we can have when studying history. If you have money, you can access digitization services, which can sometimes be quite expensive for students. You can take endless research trips. Currently, a lot of archives are limiting the time you can spend there or limiting the document amount that you can order. This means that many research trips, which could then be done in 1 day or 2 days before the pandemic, are now actually taking a week or longer. This means that those who don't live locally have to pay out much more fees for research trips, and unless they have bursaries or funding, this can be very costly. This also highlights and exaggerates the costs and the incomes of particularly smaller archives and academic institutions. For example, there might be a wealth of resources at one university that are not available and desperately needed at another university with less income, or maybe less incomes for that particular topic. Equally, archival resources, some may have more money for digitization projects, others may not. Others have access longer opening hours, and longer time people can spend in the reading rooms there because they've got more staff, and alternatively others might be manned by 1 or 2 people, limiting the hours that days that they can open, and therefore limiting research. So we need to think about these 4 main areas when thinking about what's gone on. So we want to think about how should historians and archivists collaborate in the future. So at the moment, we probably have a bit too distant relationship as historians with archivists. We really need to get to know them. We need to understand both the working practices of historians and archivists. So what are their needs? So what do archivists need to know? What do historians need from archivists? And what are the limitations? What can archivists not do for you? And what can historians not do in terms of access, digitization, and things like this? Financial and time concerns for both parties do need to be considered. So we need to think about what this is costing both the archive but also the historian. Can a student actually afford the digitization costs? Would it be cheaper for them to do a research trip? Or actually, is the archive itself not able to actually give you a good rate on digitization and photography of the sources because you've got simply too many? And actually, the cheaper option would be to visit. Also, understanding archival catalogues, thinking about them actually being detailed enough. Many catalogues are excellent. Others don't tell you anything at all. Either the catalogues themselves should be updated to be detailed enough so that historians can decide whether it's worth spending time actually ordering that one precious document that might be one of only 4 they can order for the day, or equally they should get in contact, phone, email archivists and actually get their expertise and help with this. We need to work with them more in order to waste less time. So how should things look in the sort of short or long term? So I've put both of these together here. We need to think about the continued focus on digitisation and access to these resources. So we need to make sure that the archival sector still has the money and the scope to actually continue digitisation projects. It's clear if we enter this situation again in even the near future or even the distant future, this is going to be a really important resource. Access requirements need to be thought about. People should be able to order more documents after looking at the current group that's been ordered. People who might be at the British Library, for example, for an entire day could get through 4 documents in an hour potentially, and actually it's going to have wasted a lot of money and time. So there needs to be a bit more thought into practices of ordering documents, time spent in the archives, and hopefully as we open up, longer research periods. The main thing I want to bring up is thinking about more working groups and networks for collaborative archival visits. So you could either collect someone's documents at your local archive and they can do the same at their local archive, or you could actually pay for somebody else who lives right next to, say, the British Library to actually collect your documents for you and maybe photograph them or analyse them. This would be particularly good, as I say, for people who want their documents photographed, and actually it would cost them less to pay somebody for a few hours work to go and photograph them than it would be to actually make the trip themselves. This could be both internal within institutions, it could be within countries, it could even be international. Public access to major historical databases. Now this is something that would be highly useful. So places like the British Library, if they could actually have some core funding to actually have access to certain large databases that all parties should be able to have access to outside of the basic journal article ones like JSTOR, which presumably most institutions will have access to, just to try and give some sort of continuity over primary source access. Supports for all students applying for research bursaries and grants. We really need to think about actually how we can support students in applying for money to actually conduct their research. Now that we're starting to open up, this will be a massive priority for a lot of people. The thing we're going to have to think about there is actually getting access to the archives. How do we prioritise, if we do at all, anybody actually wanting to visit to catch up with lost time on their research? And in general, it'd be nice if there was more funding for archives, but we can't wish for everything, unfortunately. A couple of things that I think we need to have a think about is we need to be careful that less well-off students are not disadvantaged through things like costly books, digitisation service costs and geographical limitations. The same with smaller institutions. They have less resources and are more affected by the shutting down of these external institutions and the closure of services such as interlibrary loans and SCONAL access. So we need to be really clear that these are important to get reinstated as soon as possible. We also need to make sure that the resources available do not shut off diverse histories of all types. Smaller archives and smaller institutions can often be more restricted in access and resources, can often have less digitised resources, which in turn affects the histories and narratives which historians produce. Solutions to this do need to be taken into account. We also need to be very careful of the wariness on the digital reliance. Now that students are used to using digital resources, they're much more likely to return to them, and their practices, their historical research practices, are much more likely to be led by digital-only sources as they've turned to them. And indeed, younger students, undergraduate students, have actually learnt through almost entire digital platforms to do their research, and therefore we need to actually introduce archival practices back into undergrad teaching as soon as possible. So just a couple of final thoughts. Students are mostly concerned with access to the resources, and solutions need to consider the financial aspects and accessibility of these, especially as they affect the histories that we are actually able to produce and share. What I would really welcome is any more points, questions, comments on anything that I've talked about in this talk today. I'm happy to elaborate on any of the points that I've made, and indeed I've probably got a lot more that I haven't actually been able to include. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing any questions.